My stuck at work, the bubble reads on my phone, plain blue against the black of the screen. 3 words, no elaboration, no apology, no time. I push the door of the diner, and the bell over it tinkles like a small, indifferent clock. The light inside is the kind of yellow that softens everything, the same color as old photographs. The waiter looks at my phone for a beat and then at me, with the kind of sympathy reserved for people whose shoes are wet or whose umbrellas have broken. He says quietly, almost as if he's telling me the weather, he's at table 5 with his fiancée. If you like honest stories about reclaiming yourself, consider subscribing. Those 2 sentences, my husband's text and the waiter's line, fit together in my head like 2 edges of a bad print. When you zoom in on a digital photo and a single pixel is off, the eye keeps returning to it. The rest of the image is fine. The mind is bothered by the one wrong dot. That's what those words did to me. A single wrong pixel in an otherwise respectable life. I stand there for a second, phone in hand, not because I'm shocked. Shock would require surprise, but because everything I'd been noticing for months arranges itself into a new pattern. It's not dramatic fireworks. It's alignment, a set of small, stubborn misfits that, when seen together, reveal a seam. A few months earlier, I thought it was me being overly precise. I design visual systems for a living. I teach shapes how to sit next to one another so the eye has somewhere to rest. People hire me to make messy things readable, so I pay attention to margins, to how light falls on stainless steel, to how a misprinted color throws a composition off kilter. In relationships, I learned, the same rules apply. Small misalignments, tiny tense pauses, a repeated word, a shirt that smells like a place you don't know, look like nothing on their own. Collected, they begin to map out an intention. It started with the little things that a husband trying to be exact would call self-care. Eric woke up earlier than he used to. He began leaving the apartment 20 minutes before we needed to be anywhere, enough time for what he called coffee runs, for a tie that had to be ironed again, for the extra line he practiced in the elevator. He'd look at himself in the bathroom mirror, twist the thin edge of his tie, and check the light like someone measuring how his face would read in an interview. He brought home shirts I'd never seen him buy, slim cuts, collars stiff as if they had rehearsed posture. He started carrying a small leather notebook that smelled faintly of leather and cigarette smoke when he forgot to close it. The notebook had neat lists inside, meetings, follow-ups, names with no context, which he claimed were work notes. The ink was too precise to be scribbles. Someone else might have drafted them. We began to have work dinners. It was a phrase that slid into dinner conversation like a polite edge. He would say it, and I could feel the syllables arranged to be unremarkable. "I'm at a work dinner," he'd text, and the language was always the same. In the first months, I accepted the pattern as normal. This was the career stage he'd always wanted, and I'd signed the paperwork too, quietly, willingly, because my support felt like an extension of what I believed we were building. I liked the idea of 2 people working toward a shared skyline. A quarter-turn smile became the next pixel. He practiced apologies. When I mentioned that a shirt smelled floral, he explained that someone at work had given it to him to borrow. When I pointed out an unfamiliar perfume, he'd laugh that laugh that was meant to diffuse and say, "You're imagining things." He'd answer a question with a rehearsed line, like a brand message. "You know I'd never do that," he'd say. The sentence was delivered in the same pitch every time, as though someone had told him, "Say this when she asks." It was effective in public. Private, it felt like someone had edited his voice. There were receipts, a post-it with a restaurant name, a parking stub folded twice that I found under an old shirt. Once a napkin with an elegantly scrawled name, Alina, folded into the pocket of a jacket I'd laundered and forgotten. The name was small, neat, and felt intentionally placed, like a watermark. He called it nothing when I asked. "Just a name," he said, "too light." He had an answer for everything. The answers never sat still the way truth does. They moved like props in a scene. I noticed a ring once. It was an unmistakable catch of light. Tiny, unfair. I found it inside his desk drawer while looking for the USB stick he'd borrowed. It was tucked beneath receipts, its box slightly worn. He came home as I was closing the drawer. I turned and caught him in the act of surprise, and he said, "It's nothing." Borrow it was, as if borrowing a diamond was a normal errand. Later, he called it a client sample, a prop to be used at an industry party. I put it back where I'd found it because there are moments when you test the water and decide you're not ready for the temperature. The small things continued to collect. A text that read Ali that arrived on his phone and then quickly disappeared. A calendar invite that never made sense. A voicemail I listened to once in the car while he showered. Ephemeral, polite, someone saying, "See you tonight," with a familiarity that sent a cold line through me. The misalignments increased in frequency until they felt like the same glitch repeating across multiple devices. There was financial asymmetry beneath all of it. The neatest breach was the loan. He came home one night with a look that was all purpose. He sat across from me at our kitchen table, our stainless steel island that I had picked for its clean reflection, and pulled a folder from his bag. The papers inside were printed, marked up, a little soft at the edges where hands had thumbed them. He said the words in a linear way, the same cadence one uses when giving an elevator pitch. They need a guarantee. It's for a client, for a project. If we show we're invested, they move faster. I need you to sign. When someone asks you to sign the bridge over your own name, the request is both small and enormous. A loan in my name was framed as a step, a practical lever to push his career over a ledge. He painted it as a temporary thing, an administrative hiccup that would expedite his promotion. He used phrasing that combined urgency with inevitability. This is how the company works, and it will be cleared in a month. The papers had signatures already in faint ink where mine would go, as if the form expected my consent. I hesitated long enough to feel the shape of the decision, and then I signed. The signature looks different on paper than it does when you whisper it out loud. On the dock, it seemed like a line you'd draw under a sentence you understood. In conversation, later, when I asked for the details, he told me it would be transferred into corporate accounts, reissued, covered. He talked about approvals and returns in a language meant to soothe. I gave him the authority to manage certain joint accounts, to sign on corporate matters while he handled the day-to-day. I did it because I trusted the symmetry of us, because I believed in the skyline we'd been drafting. Later, it would be called by someone else an authorization in my name. At the time, it felt like a logistical choice, nothing aesthetic. There is a particular kind of silence a designer learns to hear, a quiet that arrives when someone removes a single supporting line from a composition. The rest of the elements keep their place, but the absence is loud. In our apartment, the silence started when he stayed later at the office, and when he began to take again and offer less of what we'd once considered shared labor. It became louder with the appearance of a message, "Ali, meet me at 7, which I saw by accident on his phone one night while he dozed on the couch. It was a mistake to keep looking, but once you notice misalignment, you have a hard time unseeing it. I confronted him once about the loans. My voice was precise. I asked about repayment schedules and authorizations. He answered with the practiced cadence, telling me it would all be handled and that I should trust him. He told me, flatly, that he loved the life we were building, and that this was a temporary discomfort for future gain. There was an impatience to his insistence that felt like a designer trying to justify a bad choice with aesthetics. Then came the text with 3 letters, the one that set off the last buckle. He left his phone on the countertop once while I made coffee. I don't know why it was left there, carelessness or confidence. I will never call it either of those with certainty. The screen lit up with a message preview. Ali. My thumb hovered over his unlocked phone like a hesitant cursor. I didn't open the message to read the whole thread. I only needed the headline. That small word, Ali, line broke across his life in a new way. It was not work. It did not look like client or team. It was a name, efficient and precise. I took a picture of the screen with my own phone because even in the center of a storm, one acts like a designer. You document misprints. There were other signs, softer ones that you could excuse if you wanted to keep the peace. His ex talked about being just friends in a way that was too consistent to be accidental. He started meeting people in neighborhoods we'd never visited together. He took my passport for a trip that he later said had been canceled. Sometimes I'd catch him checking the light in shop windows, turning his profile to see how it read in reflection. He began to say, "Mr. Hale," with a tone of attention I had not heard before, an intonation that made me realize business had become a theater where he practiced the role he wanted to play. There was a small, private panic that lived in me during those weeks. Not the flare of dramatic scenes, but a quiet, exact panic, a set of administrative details I needed to secure. I started to inventory what was in our names, who had cards, what accounts were linked to what institutions, which signatures I was trusting him with. I wrote lists on legal pads, like I wrote design briefs, itemized and methodical. It felt ridiculous to be checking joint account forms the way one checks kerning before printing a logo. But the stakes, I understood, were quietly practical. I picked up habits that made me feel like I was regaining control. I sat with our bank app and scrolled through transactions late at night, looking for a pattern. I called to confirm certain authorizations. I wrote down dates and names and small notes in a notebook, and then hid the notebook where no one would think to look. It wasn't dramatic. It was a kind of maintenance, an insistence that misalignment can be fixed by attention. Once I followed him to the Midtown office he'd been working with. I did not expect confrontation. I expected absence. He'd told me he'd be at a client dinner, and the facts lined up, but my internal draft logic had become more literal than trust. I parked 3 blocks away and sat in the car with the heat on, watching the building like someone proofing a page. He did arrive, right on time. He stepped out of a black sedan with a tie I'd never seen, a pocket square arranged the way men spend small fortunes on language. He moved with certainty. He greeted someone with a hand that held too many notes, warm, practiced, accomplished. Beside him, for a second, a woman's hand brushed his back, familiar in a way that closed a space in me. I left before I could determine the context. The building swallowed them. Of all the scenes that would collect into an image, what mattered was this. He wore the costume of a different life, and for the first time, performed it in a place that belonged to other people. There were times I wanted the clarity of spectacle, an exposure, a confession in front of friends, a scene of righteous outrage. But spectacle is noisy. It plays to an audience. It satisfies only momentary appetite. I am not against spectacle in principle. I just prefer work that is durable. So I proceeded like someone drawing a margin and then erasing what didn't fit. The wrong text moment came months after I'd signed that loan in my name. One Saturday while he was out, his phone buzzed and I glanced at it out of curiosity because habit is a hard thing to unlearn. There it was, a message that displayed only as a preview on the locked screen. "See you tonight, Alina." The name on the preview was not capitalized as if it were a casual handle. It stood alone, deliberate. I'd seen that name before. I knew those letters the way you know a typeface you chose to hate. I scrolled back through our shared calendar and found events with client dinner that correlated with the times his messages appeared. I cross-referenced a parking ticket with a receipt for a restaurant I didn't recognize. Each item confirmed a suspicion, but still left room to doubt. Doubt is sticky. It clings. It asks the same question in different ways. Is it possible I am misunderstanding? Is it possible these are coincidences? I was trained to map variables and consider alternative explanations. So I did. I tested the variables. I called a number on a business card he left on a counter. I asked casual questions to coworkers in the early morning before I was ready to be there. No one lied. Most people are too polite for drama. They answered with the language of workplace necessity. The last convincing fragment was the moment he told me, offhand, about a dinner he had with Mr. Hale. "You know Mr. Hale?" he said one Sunday, stirring coffee with a measured hand. He said it the way you would mention weather. "He invited a few of us for dinner. It could lead to something," he added, the sentence clipped like a corner. He used Mr. Hale's name with an attention I'd felt before, an attentiveness he reserved for people whose power had the smell of authority. He spoke of potential and connections and the need for polish. He spoke as though social proximity could be purchased with the right smile. It was the sort of sentence that asks you to suspend skepticism and pay attention. In retrospect, I should have seen it not as a promise, but as a map, a line toward the place where misalignment would swell into truth. So I did the thing people do in small, careful rebellions. I opened the GPS on my phone and noticed the shared location feature Eric used to send me trivial X's and hearts when he was in meetings. It was childish but comforting to us. It had always been a benign transparency, him checking in, me watching a dot move across the city. That morning, out of a curiosity that had the shape of fear, I checked the shared location and discovered a stationary point in Midtown where the dot had been for some time. I didn't follow immediately. I made a coffee. I pretended to be composed. I sat with the data the way I would sit with a design that had a single off-color element, not yet deciding to remove, but measuring the effect. The next evening, when he told me he was stuck at work, I almost accepted it. The phrase was serviceable, soothing in its blandness. He must have rehearsed it. Bland, sufficient, unanswerable. But the dot in Midtown had been there more than once. The receipts and notes lined up in a way that required action. So I left the apartment with no plan beyond an urgency that felt like a well-focused beam. I drove with the same kind of concentration I bring to a studio at deadline. The city folded itself into a familiar map. I found the restaurant on a corner with a sleek black awning and plants clipped into a shape that suggested care. I parked 2 blocks away because proximity felt too loud. The restaurant's windows glowed that same yellow as the diner. Low, flattering, a theater in which people performed the roles the rest of the world applauded. I sat in the car for a long minute, breathing in the night, watching for a pattern. He arrived the same way he always arrived, down to the tie tuck. Alina was with him. She had a hand on his arm, a kind of ownership the rest of the world noticed without announcement. She wore a ring that caught the light and threw it back in small, blinding chips. Eric offered the kind of smile people reserve for cameras, and the woman returned it as if they'd rehearsed the angle together. They walked into the restaurant as a unit. Watching them settle at a table meant watching all our months of misalignment fold into a surprising clarity. It is odd how normal betrayal can look. It looked like good tailoring, like confident posture, like a couple in a photograph. It looked unspectacular and therefore dangerous. I waited in the shadows of the sidewalk long enough to fill all the hours that led to that moment. Memories, receipts, a small borrowed ring. And then I made a decision that was simple in theory. To know, not to accuse. To see, not to cry. There is a kind of honesty that is procedural and unsentimental. I wanted facts. I wanted the truth to stand in front of me with its hands visible. I walked toward the restaurant. Inside, the light was warmer than outside, the kind that makes faces soft and divides nothing. The host checked my coat with an almost choreographed courtesy. The carpet muffled footsteps. The room hummed with conversations that had nothing to do with me. Servers moved like choreographed blades, efficient and silent. A man in a suit lifted his hand to me as I passed the bar and whispered, "Table 5. The words slid into the space between my ribs, the way a cold rod presses into warm water. When I reached their table, I could see the way Alina gestured as though she'd practiced small talk. She had an air of someone accustomed to being in rooms where names matter. Mr. Hale's presence was rumored and thick. Eric's proximity to him had the sheen of someone moving into a new social orbit. I stood at the edge of it all and felt the width of my own containment. I could have made a scene, could have struck while the audience was present, could have called out names and thrown papers like feathers into a wind. But my training in removing clutter kept me from the theatrical. Clutter obscures shape, it does not reveal it. The forms of betrayal often dissolve under a clear, sharp light. Not a scream, but the light on a table that reveals fingerprints and smudges. A server approached, polished and unobtrusive. He put a hand briefly on the back of my chair and said, again, so no one would think it was targeted at me alone, "He's at table 5 with his fiancée." There was nothing performative about the sentence. It was not meant to wound. It was a fact, delivered like a small clinical report that only I seemed to be reading as anything more than logistics. At that moment, the world felt like a page where one line of type had been set wrong. Everything else was in order. The waiter's voice was like the soft tap of a single key in a quiet room. I felt the familiar design urge to correct the composition. I set down my bag and looked at them. Eric's jaw was a square I'd known for years. His smile was strained in the way of someone who had rehearsed the movement. Alina laughed at something he said, the sound a small bell. The ring on her hand caught a light and threw it like currency. The pressure I had been holding in a slow, mechanical way, inventorying authorizations, cross-referencing receipts, lining up evidence, slept like an animal that wakes when its moment comes. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't make a tableau. I reached into my bag for the one thing I had brought with the intent to be orderly: the folder with the loan documents, copies of the bank transfers, a redacted set of authorizations showing signatures in my name. I had prepared them like a designer prepares a mock-up. Neat, legible, unable to be mistaken. When I set the folder on the corner of their table, the sound it made was soft but precise, like a stamp. Conversation around us continued. Someone at the bar laughed. The server hovered politely, as if expecting an exchange to take a social shape. Eric looked up, recognition breaking like a fragile surface. Alina's face shifted in a way I had seen in photographs, where a person realizes they have been photographed in a private act. No one shouted. No one clutched at decor. The scene was too small to feel cinematic. Its power came from the everyday quality of its revelation. He said something. My name, maybe. The tilt of his voice trying to rearrange the moment into an explanation. I said, "You promised I would be covered." The sentence a clean line. I did not raise the pitch. There was no performance in it. It sounded like the name of a file you opened to inspect. There were quick words, and the server's face folded over with the quick, practiced attention to the suddenness of personal matters in a public setting. Eric's hands moved in a way I recognized from old arguments, a man trying to trade air for logic. Alina's eyes flicked to the papers, and then to him in a way that was looking for a map. I watched the ring catch a light, and then drop out of view as the conversation pivoted around a small, sinking island of fact. They expected drama. That's the assumption when someone places an accusation in public. They expected an argument, raised voices, perhaps a scene that would provide story. But the format of betrayal is often not melodramatic. It is procedural. It is signatures and ledgers and the quiet arithmetic of who signed what in an office at 2 p.m. It is the exactness of a stamp. Eric's face moved through stages of color, pale explanation, then a tightness I could see in the compression of his mouth. He tried to say things that arranged the paper into a narrative where he was acting on my behalf. I watched, cataloging gestures like annotations and margins. Alina looked at the folder as if it were a misprint, something that did not yet belong in the glossy layout of her life. For a second, her fingers toyed with the napkin ring at her glass. She said nothing. Her face did something I had rehearsed in my head but had never really seen. an almost immediate recalculation. The woman who had laughed with him a minute before now had the look of someone whose social scaffolding had been softly shifted. It wasn't theatrical humiliation so much as the dull recognition that a prop had been removed from a stage set. People nearby glanced up because humans are curious about how stories rearrange themselves. No one filmed. No one intervened. I did not want an audience. I wanted fidelity. Facts, not fever. I had folded my private doubt into tidy evidence and placed it where truth could choose its own shape. When I left, I did so without ceremony. I did not shout. I did not salvage anything from the encounter to display as triumph. I walked out the way I had walked in, simple, with a particular attention to the way the city smoothed its edges at night. The light on the pavement reflected off the puddles like a test print come back with one wrong shade. My phone buzzed in my pocket, his name lighting up the screen, but I did not answer. I sat in the car for a few minutes and then drove home with the steady patience of someone who had set a design in motion. Back in the apartment, the stainless steel island reflected the overhead light, cleaned, clinical. I laid out the copies of the documents on the counter like samples. The signature that had once felt like a small concession now looked like a line that had been hijacked. The redaction I had done to the bank numbers did not obscure the fact that the instrument existed. The loan in my name was a fact. The misalignments had given it context. I did what you do when you find a wrong pixel in a file. You prepare to correct it. There are practical things one does when the aesthetic has gone wrong. You call your bank. You call a lawyer. You freeze accounts if the account manager lets you. You unlink cards where you can. You put a red circle around authorizations in a calendar and list deadlines like a brief. You take pictures of paper and back them up to a cloud. It's administrative work, mundane and sturdy, and it is another way of refusing spectacle. That night, I slept with the documents in a drawer next to my bed. They were small, heavy things when you consider them in a pile. I dreamed of lines and margins and the way a single misprinted glyph can ruin a page. I dreamed of the way light catches a ring and turns an intention into a bright, hard thing. In the quiet hours before dawn, I thought about what I would do next. The city outside was waking with its small engines and coffee smells. The apartment was a series of measured noises, an old radiator hiss, the tick of the clock. I did not imagine revenge as cinematic destruction. I imagined process, calls to the bank first thing, a lawyer who would look at papers and say 2 words I needed to hear, "We can," and then a list of small, potent fixes. I imagined myself walking into a new apartment with 1 rug and a desk and a plant, the things that declare a life renewed by restraint rather than spectacle. The next morning, when the world was orange and soft, and the apartment felt like a page being turned, my phone lit up again with messages I could not yet respond to. The waiter at the diner had been correct. Table 5, but that only arranged the problem into visibility. Facts are tidy. People are messy. The work was not in the reveal, but in what you do with the revealed. I poured a coffee, set a pen on a legal pad, and wrote a list. Call bank, lawyer, freeze authorizations, copies of documents, photographs of receipts. Each entry was a small act of reclamation. The work ahead was administrative, dull and practical, and it suited me because truth, in the end, is the kind of thing you approach with patient hands. I had not decided what I would say to Eric beyond asking for clarity. Clarity can look different depending on who speaks it. For me, it was not accusation or theatrics. It was documentation, a sequence of acts that would either be explained or not. Either way, I would be making room. Either way, the design of my life would continue, perhaps with new margins. There was a message from him later that day. "We need to talk." It landed in my inbox like another neutral pixel. I did not answer immediately. I put on shoes and walked to the corner bakery to feel the city move around me. People bought croissants and read newspapers. The world had not recalibrated itself to match my internal layout. It never does. Betrayal is personal. Public life keeps its own momentum. When I returned home, I sat at the island and opened the folder. I spread out the pages like samples and began the first practical acts of repair. Phone calls that were short and precise, not performances. I left the documents in the folder on the counter, where the light caught the edges and made them look like a thin stack of things that would change the next few months. There is a strange calm in the moment after you choose honesty. You do not feel victorious. You feel exact. You feel a small, cold relief that finally comes with the tidy ending of information. The story I had been telling myself about trust, about name, about partnership was changing its font. I could either redraw it or let it go. My instinct as a designer is to redraw. My instinct as a person was to keep what was useful and discard the rest. I had prepared for small things: a lawyer's contact, a list of bank actions, an inventory of accounts. I had prepared emotionally to be precise. No flourish, no fury. Precision is its own form of clarity. It requires the same patience as any craft. And yet, even as I placed a call to the bank and heard the polite professional murmur into the line, there was the weight of the unknown still looming like negative space. The diner and the waiter and the phrase "Table 5" had given me a point of clarity. The rest, what people would say, how Mr. Hale might respond, whether Alina would speak at all, was a field of possibility I did not yet want to map. There are moments when the best action is to stop and measure. To wait is not always weakness. Sometimes it is the act of reading a composition before you ink a correction. I left the folder on the counter because evidence, like design, benefits from being visible. I answered the bank and made an appointment with a lawyer for the following morning. I arranged to have a few accounts frozen. These are not bold actions. They are maintenance. But maintenance is also a way of taking back space. In the kitchen, the stainless steel reflected a single, precise line of light. It split the countertop like a margin. Outside, the city continued its small choreography. Inside, I had the evidence, the documents, and the steady knowledge that the work ahead would be administrative, patient, and exact. The moment in the restaurant had been the hinge. Now the hinge would turn slowly, by calls and letters and the steady, quiet work of unpicking signatures. I sat down at the island and made a cup of coffee that tasted like attention. I opened my laptop, laid out copies of the emails, and began to draft a timeline. The rhythm of the task was calming. Each entry was a deliberate stroke: date, action, evidence, like plotting points on a grid so that a line might be drawn. The line would show what had been misaligned. Once the line is drawn, you can decide whether to correct the spacing or to start anew. The phone buzzed again. This time it was a number I didn't recognize. An assistant at Mr. Hale's office, perhaps, or a colleague who had heard the edges of things. For now, I let it go to voicemail. I did not want to be pulled into performance. I wanted to keep the work procedural. In the weeks that would follow, I would discover more small things: signatures misplaced, authorizations that needed rescinding, friends who reached out with the slow intimacy of people who notice when you are bravely doing the practical things. I didn't know how far the ripple of the folder I had left on that table would travel. Perhaps it would prompt a suspension, perhaps only a private repair. I only knew that I had moved myself from suspicion into action, which is a kind of agency. For now, the page was open. The dot on the GPS had been correct. The waiter at the diner had been right. Table 5 existed on a night when I needed it to exist. The rest of the design, a new life or an alteration of the old, would be made from the durable materials of paperwork, calls, and measured decisions. I placed my pen down and let my hands rest. The next task was to call the lawyer and set the day for the first question to be asked in a place that would record it. Outside, the late light played on the stainless steel island, bright and indifferent. Inside, I had the documents and the slow, deliberate plan to reclaim what had been signed away. The work would be quiet. The truth would not need a crowd. The next hours felt like a slow, disciplined unraveling. I drove home with the folder on the passenger seat as if it were a fragile model, something to be consulted, not displayed. The city slid by in familiar frames: a cyclist, a dog walker, a late-night deli sign. Each small scene reinforced a humbling fact: life goes on whether or not your composition has been compromised. In that ordinary continuity, the extraordinary work of undoing a misalignment begins. His phone buzzed in my pocket soon after I walked into the apartment. It was him, short and urgent. "Are you okay?" I did not answer. I set the documents down on the stainless steel island, where they were easy to see and harder to ignore. The light cut across the metal the way a blade finds a seam. I called the bank first. The woman on the line was careful and polite. She asked for account numbers and verification, and then told me, without drama, that they would place a temporary hold while they reviewed the transfers. It felt bureaucratic and enormous at once. Then I called a lawyer. I'd looked up months earlier when I'd first felt the shape of something wrong. I had kept her name like a spare key, maybe unnecessary, but comforting to know existed. She was precise on the phone in a way that cleared the fog. "We'll need everything you have," she said. "Copies, dates, the authorizations you signed. We'll request freezes and put a stop to further transfers while we draft letters." Her tone was businesslike. No condolence, no theatrical language, only competence. It was exactly what I needed. By midday there was a call that, for a moment, I thought would be a personal salvo. Instead, it was the sound of consequence. A number I did not recognize. Formal and measured. Mr. Hale's assistant. She asked if I could speak with someone in the chairman's office about an internal matter. I gave the information I had: dates, receipts, the loan documents details, because the work of correcting misalignment is always transactional. She thanked me and said someone would follow up. The caller's voice had the same quality as the waiter's: factual, detached, and unmistakably consequential. That afternoon I heard from Eric in staccato fragments, texts that begged for explanation, voicemails that tried to rearrange the scene into something plausible. His messages read like rehearsed lines, quick attempts at a script he hoped would settle the composition back into balance. I saved everything. His company's HR department contacted me within 48 hours. There was a formal statement about initiating an internal review and placing him on administrative suspension pending the outcome. The words were exactly what I had wanted, and not more. A process had begun. There would be no immediate spectacle, only the steady machinery of corporate consequence. Word moved in small circulations. One friend texting to ask if I was all right. Another offering meals I politely declined because the work ahead required a particular kind of solitude. People reached out with the polite curiosity of those who don't want to pry but want to be present. Some checked in and then faded. Others remained. There were messages from mutual acquaintances that read like drafts you throw away, phrases arranged to be sympathetic without committing to judgment. It was consoling and lonely at the same time. Alina did not contact me for a week. When she did, it was not an apology. It was a message that read like the press release of someone adjusting a roster. I saved it, the way you keep a copy of a certificate, not because it changes anything, but because it completes the timeline. Eventually, I would hear that the wedding had been called off. A mutual friend forwarded a short note from Alina's entourage. Plans postponed. That was enough. The scaffolded life they'd been rehearsing quietly dissolved under the weight of documentation. I did not seek to humiliate. I had not gone to the restaurant to perform. I had gone to gather facts and place them where they could be seen. When the world responded with memos and administrative checks, I allowed the process to proceed in the currency it required: evidence, dates, signatures. The bank put temporary holds on accounts associated with the loan. The corporate legal team requested documents. The company placed Eric on leave pending the investigation. The terms used in official emails were clinical: pending, under review, suspended. Those words carried with them the authority of institutions. They also marked the end of a certain private complacency. There were small practical victories that felt disproportionate in their emotional steadiness. A bank rep told me an authorization I had given could be rescinded with immediate effect. A teller walked me through forms to unlink accounts I'd once trusted him with. My lawyer drafted an initial complaint that read with the cold clarity of a brief. I filed for temporary measures that would prevent him from making further unilateral financial moves. None of it was theatrical. None of it soothed the rawness. But each act tightened the shape of a new margin around my life. The day I signed the initial divorce paperwork was not dramatic. It happened in a small glass-fronted office with a potted succulent on the windowsill and a stack of forms that looked like a set of architectural drawings. The lawyer explained the sequence of steps, the likely timeline, and the practicalities. Division of accounts, the question of liabilities attached to my name, the dissolution of authorizations. I nodded and signed where indicated. The signature on the legal form was a different line from the one on the loan. That other signature had been a misaligned pixel. This one was a deliberate stroke to redraw the page. Packing came slowly. I had imagined leaving to be sudden, a dramatic egress with a suitcase thrown over a shoulder, a door slammed for effect. Instead, moving out required me to measure and choose. I listed what I wanted to keep and what I wanted to let go of. I shipped boxes with books and the minimal tools I needed to work, and left the rest in neat piles for donation. When I mirrored the apartment for the last time, the stainless steel island reflected a kitchen smaller by necessity, but cleaner in intention. I took only what fit the new composition I wanted: practical, uncluttered, honest. My new place was smaller, bright in the way the DNA had promised. A single window that let in light from the street, a narrow balcony where I could stand with a cup of coffee and watch the city arrange itself. I chose 3 purchases with the same deliberation I applied to a brief: a desk with clean lines, a rug that folded a room into a rectangle of warmth, and a plant that would live on the windowsill and remind me of slow tending. The desk was a pale wood. The rug was not extravagant, but had a color that made the whole room feel intentional. The plant was a simple green thing that leaned toward the light in the mornings. Each item was a small act of design, reclaiming a space by deciding what would sit within it. Friends helped with the move. They carried boxes and said things that meant more than their words, things like, "You're steady," and "You knew what you needed to do." Their presence was the quiet kind of solidarity that is not performative. It was the person who brings you tea while you sign a paper, the one who watches your plant be placed on a sill and knows it's a symbol not of recovery, but of continued attention. There were moments when I felt foolishly tender with what had been. A mug I'd bought in a city we had once visited sits now on my new desk. I keep it not as a relic, but as a small artifact of change, something that reads the old life but doesn't anchor me to it. The sound of the kettle in the morning is different now. It is not punctuated by shared routines, but by a steady and deliberate personal rhythm. I work with my laptop at the desk, managing projects, making clients' pages readable. The work is familiar and necessary. It is the thing that reminds me I have professional competence beyond any private betrayal. As the weeks passed, the corporate memo circulated more widely. There was an internal announcement about an investigation and the suspension. It was brief and administrative. A few colleagues messaged me with offers of assistance. Some regretted that they hadn't noticed. Others simply said they were sorry. I did not want explanations, and I did not want apologies that wanted to be admission. What I needed was the quiet work of re-establishing boundaries. The company's actions, the bank's holds, and the cancellation of plans around a wedding made that work possible. There were small prosaic victories: authorizations rescinded, cards unlinked, signatures voided. There were also the small inconveniences of bureaucracy, forms to sign, identity verifications, calls to creditors to explain circumstances. Those inconveniences were the price of clarity. They were mundane and yet potent. Each completed form felt like a minute restoration of agency. The loan in my name remained a blot on a page, but the page was now under review rather than being silently accepted. I do not pretend that the process was cathartic in a cinematic sense. There was no immediate karmic collapse of the other party into ruin. There was no public shaming performance that settled everything into a tidy moral photograph. Instead, there was a slow administrative sorting that in its own unromantic way repaired the architecture of my life. Processes moved, reviews, holds, memos. People who had power responded to evidence, not spectacle. I learned to respect the steady bureaucracy that can, when prompted, correct a misprint. He called sometimes, shorter and more frequent at first, less frequent later. I answered when I needed clarity and allowed calls to go to voicemail when I did not. Once, he left a message that attempted to contain explanation within sentences that sounded like made-up facts. I saved it in a folder labeled with a date. I kept everything because documents keep the lines straight where memory can bend. There were nights when I sat on the small balcony with the plant and thought about how the ring had caught the light in the restaurant. I imagined light passing through and scattering, nothing solid left to be hoarded. I thought about Alina's hand, the practiced angle of their photos, the careful choreography of social assent. I did not feel triumphant. I felt exact. There was relief, but it was the relief of someone who has completed careful work and knows there are still small tasks to be done. Months later, when the immediate flurry had settled, I found myself redesigning more than a living room. I redesigned a daily routine, which is, in the end, the scaffolding of a life. Mornings began with coffee and a small inventory, emails checked, tasks written in a notebook, a glance at the plant to make sure it had not been neglected. Evenings were quieter. I allowed myself to read without a clock in the corner telling me what the next obligation would be. I met people slowly in new contexts, clients, friends, a neighbor who tended her balcony geraniums with the same gentle patience I do. The plant flourished, the rug softened the room, the desk became the new center of gravity. Each object declared a choice. I had not built a life.